So as I said, this is part 2 in our series. Today we're going to be talking to kids about consent and boundaries. In part 1, 2 weeks ago, we talked about parenting after trauma and some of the effects that trauma can have on kids and also on folks throughout their lives. So if you missed that, there is a recording of it available on YouTube. If you need the link for it, you can email Nicole or Kayla, I think, at SCFS, or you can email me, and I'm going to share my email address later to get that recording and the workbook that went along with it. And some of that stuff is going to be kind of foundational to what we're talking about today. But if you missed the first part, you can still jump in with what we're going to talk about today. But if you go back and watch it, there might be some stuff that kind of ties in. So a little bit about who we are. So I'm Jen, the Community Partnerships and Public Education Coordinator at KSACC, the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center. And I am joined today by Heidi, and she's one of our counselors. So she does the Stopping the Violence and the Sexual Abuse Intervention and Prevention program. Yep. So she works with both youth and adults who have experienced gender-based violence. And so she's going to be here today, especially for our Q&A section, to kind of chat about how some of these things might come up when working with kids. And just, yeah, Heidi's got a great wealth of experience in working with kids and families. So we're lucky to have her with us this morning.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me.
So a couple of things, just to remind you to keep your microphone muted. As I said, for those who have just joined, we're going to have some time at the end for a bit of a Q&A where we can chat a bit more informally. We won't record that part of the session. So at that point, it might be a little bit more comfortable to chat. But just in the meantime, to keep your microphones off just so that we don't have background noise and distraction. You can save those questions till the end and you can type them in the chat. Either if you want them answered right now, or if you just don't want to forget something that comes up for you, you can type it in there and we'll get to them at the end. And then also just to be mindful of confidentiality. So even though we won't be recording the Q&A, just to be thinking about not mentioning specifics of your family or your kids or other people's kids. So you can ask questions about situations that you're experiencing potentially, but just sort of leaving out any of those details that would let other people know the identity of who you're talking about. Also want to just start by acknowledging that we are gathering today, or at least I am presenting today from the territory of the Kamloops Equipment, and just thinking about this land and how I really just wake up grateful every day to be living in this beautiful place and thinking about the people who have been taking care of it from the beginning, and how my actions and the work that I do here, I want to strive to every day add to the caretaking of this place and leaving it as good or better as when I came, because I am very grateful to be a guest here. So I just wanted to talk about a little bit of an overview of what we're going to go through today. So we're going to talk about, like, what are boundaries? I think that boundaries and consent are words that we hear a lot and kind of concepts that we sometimes have vague understandings about what they mean or what they might mean for us, but we're going to kind of dive into a little bit of definitions around them. And so then again, talking about what is consent and some more specifics. And then we're going to talk about how do we talk to kids about boundaries and consent, and thinking about both how can we start to foster an understanding of those things in younger kids, and then how do we talk about those things with older kids and teens. And then we're going to talk about the role that trauma might play in helping people understand how to even recognize their own boundary setting, and how to give consent and how to ask for consent, and how sometimes when we've experienced trauma, boundary setting, which can be hard for any of us at any time, can be even that little bit harder because of some of the ways that trauma can affect a person. And so we'll chat a little bit about how why that is and how we might be able to help unravel that a little bit for kids who have experienced trauma. So for those who don't know, as I said, Heidi and I both work at the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center. And so we're a feminist organization who support individuals who've experienced sexualized violence. And when we say sexualized violence, we really mean any kind of violence that's based on a person's gender and is intended to humiliate, harm, or control that person. And so we also understand this to include things like family violence, domestic violence, stalking, harassment, and those sorts of things. And so we have been serving the community for almost 40 years. And we have counseling programs for both adults and kids. And we do one-on-one and group counseling. We also have a 24-hour crisis response, which is both our 1-800 crisis hotline number, which I'm going to actually give you in a moment. And we also do hospital accompaniment for people who have experienced violence and are seeking supports at the hospital. As well as all of that, we also have community-based victim services, which help people navigate the legal system after they have experienced an assault. So just a bit of a background about the work that we do and why we're here talking to you today. So this is our 1-800 number, and this is a support line that's available to anyone in the community over the age of 13 who has experienced any form of gender-based violence at any point in their life. And I wanted to give this number today just as a way to say that there are supports available for you. If there's anything in the presentation today that brings anything up for you, we know that the rates of violence are extremely and unacceptably high. And so sometimes talking about things like boundaries and consent, and we're not going to be talking about anything in really like sort of alarming detail today, but sometimes just thinking about these things can bring up some stuff for us around our history or things that we've experienced. And so it's really normal if you're feeling after a presentation like this, that you feel a little bit like overwhelmed or uncomfortable, or if it brings up something for you. And so I would encourage you to jot down this number if it seems like that might be good support. And also if it might not even be for yourself, but it might bring up something for you that someone in your life has experienced. And if you just need someone to talk to and you want maybe more resources, then this is a place to reach out as well. And even if you have a reaction to the presentation that you don't feel you need to reach out to somebody, I also just wanted to take a moment to recognize that those kinds of feelings after talking about things like this are completely normal. And so, just to recognize that if you go away from this feeling a little bit unsettled or a little bit blue, or maybe a little bit even just extra tired, just recognize that that's totally normal and okay. And just be sure to take the time to take a little bit extra good care of yourself this afternoon or whenever you're watching this. I wanted to start by just offering some self-reflection questions before we get into the presentation, just to sort of start thinking about the ways in which you might already be thinking about boundaries and consent. And so we're not going to go through and answer these or anything, but just to kind of think about how you would answer these questions, or maybe reflecting on the fact that maybe you wouldn't have an answer to some of these questions, and that's totally okay too. It's just a little bit of an understanding of where we're starting from before we dive into the content. So thinking about what is the relationship between boundaries and consent, because I think we talk about these things a lot and they're not the same thing, but they are related. And thinking about where do we ask for or give consent? So often conversations about consent are framed around things that have to do with sex, but consent is a concept that applies to so many facets of our life. And so sometimes we don't even think about areas where giving consent or asking for it. And sometimes that can help reframe the way we think about it in a sexual context, is to think about other places where we give consent, where it seems maybe a little bit easier, maybe a little bit more normalized. And then thinking about where are there areas where we should ask for consent, but maybe we don't. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, especially with little kids. Like sometimes the way that we ask kids to interact with adults without considering maybe whether or not they want to. And thinking a little bit about what you were taught or what you weren't taught about what boundaries and consent are when you were a kid. And so maybe reflecting on good influences you had in your life that helped you set good boundaries, or thinking about places where you felt like you wish you had a bit more autonomy as a kid and how you might be able to reflect that in your caregiving. And then reflecting on where would you like to have better boundaries in your life, if anywhere, and how do you think that you might be able to do that? And so, like I said before, setting boundaries is not always easy depending on the context and the situation, but it is something that you can work on and get better at with some intention. So I wanted to start off by just talking a little bit about what boundaries are. And so boundaries are limits that we set to protect and take care of ourselves. And this can be in all kinds of different realms. Like I was saying, sometimes we think about these things in terms of like physical and sexual boundaries, but we also set emotional boundaries, energetic, spiritual, and financial boundaries, all kinds of things in our lives where we decide like, this is my line about whatever the situation is, and this is where I'm going to put that boundary to protect myself in one way or another. And we'll talk a little bit more about some specifics of what that might look like in the next slide. And setting boundaries, as I've said, isn't always easy, and it's going to be influenced by a lot of things. And you might find that setting boundaries with certain people is easier than others, or in certain situations. And that's going to have a lot to do with how you were raised, the culture that you were raised in, even like media that you're exposed to. I think that we see a lot of really bad examples of boundary setting in medias and boundary crossing. And so I think that a lot of us have sometimes really mixed understanding of what boundaries look like and what it looks like both to set them for ourselves and to respect them for other people. And so it can sort of sound sometimes like an easy thing. You understand what your boundary is and you set it. But just because you've set a boundary doesn't always mean that someone's going to respect it. And so it is a bit of an ongoing process that requires intention and communication on everyone involved. So I wanted to give some examples just so that we can understand that there are tons of different ways that we set boundaries in our life. So like I said, there can be physical boundaries, which is basically sort of what you do with your body. And that might mean things like you decide who you like to hug. Like maybe you're really a hugger, or maybe you're not, and you just hug some of your certain close friends and not others. But another physical boundary could be like not going on a roller coaster or not going skydiving. You just decide like, these are the things that I'm not willing to do with my body. And so, and again, like that's a boundary that might be easier to set because it really only involves you and not other people. And then things like saying no to physical intimacy when you're not in the mood, which I think again is kind of sometimes what we think about with boundaries is those more sort of more physical and intimate boundary settings. A financial boundary might be that there are people that you choose not to lend money to, or that you have a boundary around how much money you put aside and you just keep for savings and you don't touch it. So that could be an example of a financial boundary. Emotional boundaries are things like, limiting how much news you watch because you know that you can be overwhelmed by being exposed to too much bad news. Or on days when you're feeling really overwhelmed and you get a phone call and it's from someone who you know might be needing more from you than you have to give, just deciding like, okay, I'm going to call them later when I have more emotional capacity to deal with it. An energetic boundary might look like deciding that you had set an intention to go for a run, but now you're feeling too tired, so you're just going to go for a walk instead. Or saying no to something that you just don't feel up to doing. Like, you told someone you were going to go out for drinks, but like you're just feeling way too tired. And so you decide, okay, I'm going to set a boundary for myself. I'm not going to go out tonight. And a spiritual boundary might look like making time for practices that are important or meaningful to you. So that might look like, something formal, like you go to church, or you just have a ritual that you do for yourself that gives you meaning, and it's something that you have space around. And so I just wanted to go through all of that because I think that sometimes it's easier to conceptualize these things when we understand that they can look like a lot of different things, and that there are lots of different scenarios where we're setting boundaries, and that can sort of start us thinking about the ways in which we might approach some of the aspects of boundary setting that are easier, and then how we might be able to apply that to some of the things that we struggle with. And also, again, to be able to talk to kids about boundary setting, and you don't have to start with things like having it be about big things that are about their body boundaries or physical boundaries, but it can start with little things about like how they choose to spend their time, or things like that, and just building up, especially with younger kids, so that they understand what they want and what they need, and then how to set the boundaries for themselves so that they feel safe. And so then next we're going to look at what is consent. And so consent is an ongoing, enthusiastic, and freely given agreement to partake in any activity involving more than one person. Again, we often frame conversations about consent around sex, but consent is applicable in lots of situations in our lives. And then consent is an important part of respecting our own and other people's personal boundaries. And so that's kind of how those two things go hand in hand, is that when we understand what our boundaries are, then we can also respect the boundaries of other people. And so I wanted to kind of chat a little bit about how those two things are quite interrelated, because when we have an understanding of where we set our limits, it can give us more empathy to understand where other people might set theirs. And so spending time understanding your own personal boundaries can teach you really a lot about yourself and how to ask someone else for what you need. And it can also help you understand that other people's boundaries might be different from yours, and you might not understand why, but you can still respect that. And so this can really help to mitigate situations where consent isn't received or where boundaries are violated just because there's a misunderstanding or there isn't clear communication about what both people want. Because we know that there are definitely times when boundaries are being violated and consent isn't being asked for or received, where that's more of an intentional, controlling, and violent situation. But there are also lots of times when it feels like a little bit more of a gray area. And that's where communication becomes really important. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too, about how we say a lot of things around consent, and especially when it comes to sex, about no means no. And that is absolutely a true and really important concept to understand. But we often don't talk about how we can feel safer saying no and how we can respect when someone does say no. And so I think that it's really important to be digging a little bit more into those things about why sometimes boundaries aren't being respected, and how we can get better at both understanding our own needs and respecting the needs of the people that we're interacting with. And the other thing that I want to say about boundaries that I think is really important when we're having these conversations is that boundaries, no matter how good our boundaries are, they can't always keep us safe from someone who is going to harm us. And I think that that's really important to say, because I think boundaries are often weaponized against people who are living with violence or abuse, or people will say, why didn't you just you need to set better boundaries, you need to protect yourself more, which can sort of suggest that if you were just doing a better job at enforcing your boundaries, that you wouldn't be being harmed. But we know that experiencing violence is never the person who is experiencing that violence's fault. It's the choice of the person who is choosing to violate your boundaries and to cause that harm to you. And so I think that it's really good to keep that in mind, because it can become a little bit of a way that people can blame a person who is experiencing violence, but violence is never something that you can consent to. And so if you have set a boundary with someone, and whether it's a physical, emotional, any of the kinds of abuse that can be experienced, you've never allowed that to happen by not having a good enough boundary. So I just want to make sure that that is clear, because I think that sometimes we can get so caught up in this idea that if we had better boundaries, we would never be harmed. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. And so what we can do is get better at having these conversations and get better at understanding what our own needs are, so that we can have good communication with the people who want to treat us well, but sometimes maybe just aren't sure what we need or what they need. And so if we can sort of normalize talking about these things, then I think that that's the place where we can see really start improving, especially with kids when they're just getting into dating and kind of interpersonal relationships, that is a really important time for them to be able to understand how talking about these things and just normalizing having conversations about what their boundaries are and asking consent of their friends and intimate partners is so important. So we're going to talk about talking about these things with teens and kind of getting into specifics around like consent and sexual relationships. But first, I just want to start by talking about how do we talk about these things with younger kids, which is sometimes a little bit easier. And so I wanted to just show you this quick little 2-minute video that I think does quite a good job about talking to kids about consent. And so I'm going to put that on now. I think I might have to switch my share just a moment.
For kids. This is you. Okay, it doesn't look exactly like you, but let's say it's you. This is your body, and you get to decide what you do with your body. No one else is entitled to tell you what to do with your body. Not your friends, not strangers, not adults you know. No one is entitled to decide what you do with your body, except you. That's called bodily autonomy, by the way. And that's what consent is all about. Everyone is different. Some people love to hug, and some people hate hugs. And each person gets to decide what they're comfortable with. Can a hug-loving person just start hugging someone at random? Nope. They need consent. How do people know if they have consent? They ask. Would you like a hug?
Yes, I would. Can I hold your hand?
I'd rather not.
Okay.
If a person doesn't say yes,
Can I hug you?
then they haven't given their consent. It's really pretty simple. Ask for consent, listen to the answer. By the way, if a person bribes someone or threatens someone to say yes, that's not consent. Sometimes adults will try to tell a kid what to do with their body.
Go kiss Aunt Doris goodbye.
But the kid still gets to decide. No thanks, that makes me uncomfortable. I'll just wave goodbye. Some things kids can't consent to. They can't enter into legal contracts. They can't vote. And they can't consent to sexual stuff, 'cause they're kids. So if an adult does something that kids can't consent to, that's not okay. The adult is wrong, and it's not the kid's fault. And that's when it's most important to tell a trusted adult, like a teacher. Why? Because it's your body. And no one else is entitled to tell you what to do with it. Practice consent.
All right, get back into the slides. So I like that video because I think it's just kind of a nice, simple way for kids to understand. The one thing that I do think, again, like we often sort of stop the conversation at ask someone for consent. If they say no, you just say, okay, that's fine. But I think it's often a little bit more complicated than that because asking for consent can bring up a lot of vulnerabilities. And so sometimes getting a no can be, it can feel not great. And we don't often talk about what to do with that not great feeling when we've asked someone for consent and we've been rejected. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But just to point out, I feel like that's the one thing they could have gone into a bit more with that video. But I think for a sort of 101 on consent for kids, I think it does a good job. And I just love that kid's voice. So a few different things to think about when we're talking to younger kids about consent is we want to foster empathy. So helping them to understand that other people have feelings, which when you're hanging out with little kids, it sometimes feels like they really do not get that. And that is a skill that comes like at a certain developmental stage in life. But the more we can kind of ask them to think about how other people feel, then the more that they understand that other people have boundaries and limitations and feelings just like they do. So saying things like, how do you think your sister feels when you take her things without asking? Or any other situations where they might be doing something that's, they're not trying to be harmful, but that they haven't taken that moment to think about how the other person feels in that situation. Another thing that can help with that, especially because it helps to foster that empathy, is to name emotions and teach kids how to express them safely. And so we talked about this quite a bit last time too, when we were talking about trauma and some of those protective factors, helping kids understand what they're feeling and also understand that having emotions is okay. It's what we do with those emotions that is important. So if a kid's getting really riled up, and some kids, really like to roughhouse when they're feeling excited, but just because they're in that mood and they want to do that doesn't mean that the person that they're trying to interact with is on the same page. So, naming their emotions, saying like, I see that you're really excited, but it looks like your brother doesn't feel like being wrestled right now. So maybe going outside to run around instead. So giving them an option of what they can do with that emotion. Allowing for choice also helps kids understand what their own boundaries are. And so like you showed in that video, not necessarily forcing kids to give hugs to people or give kisses to family members, which can sometimes be hard depending on the family that you grow up in, because sometimes that is a bit of an expectation. But it's really important that kids understand that they don't have to interact with people in a physical way if they don't want to. And so again, you can give them options so that they still have a way to interact with the person. Maybe it's a high five, or maybe they just wave, or maybe they just go up and say hello. Like there are ways that kids can still show respect if that's a value that you want to instill in them without forcing them to do something that makes them uncomfortable. And then teaching kids that boundaries go both ways. So we want to teach kids that they are allowed to say no. And we also want to teach them that their friends and family members are allowed to say no as well. And so again, that goes back to fostering that empathy of understanding that everyone has things that they're comfortable with, and that might even change from day to day. And so helping them understand that just because someone says no to something that they wanted to do, it doesn't mean that they've been rejected, or that person doesn't like them, and that there might be other ways that they can interact with that person. And then we can model consent ourselves for kids. And so instead of just hugging your kids or, just asking their permission before you do something. So, instead of saying like, oh, it looks like you're sad, and just wrapping them in a hug, and maybe that is what they want. And, these things are, if you know your kid too, and you know that they're giving you a signal that that's what they want. But you can just ask them, just normalize asking before you give them a hug, or just, any kinds of opportunities to ask for consent, or with other people too, when your kids are around, just modeling that's a thing that is, that can be just a normal part of interacting with friends and family. And then you can also point out and talk about consent and boundary examples on TV. Like I was saying before, I think we get a lot of really sort of toxic messages about consent and boundaries from media. Like, so many movie plots where it's usually that a guy is asking a girl out on a date and she says no, and then sort of this romantic situation unfolds where he just won't take no for an answer, and he just keeps asking until she says yes, which is just all kinds of wrong. And so I think it's important when we're watching media to be critical about things like that and point out to kids like, this guy keeps asking this girl on a date, but she said no. Like, how do you think she feels about that? That doesn't actually really seem romantic. It seems like he's not respecting her. So I think that those kinds of conversations too can be really impactful and important. There we go. Okay. So then I have another, just a short video again about this one aimed more for teens, and it just talks about how we can normalize asking for consent around physical relationships, just like we ask for consent about all kinds of other things, which I think was quite well done, and just sort of shows what it could look like if we just got good at asking for consent in all kinds of situations. So I'm going to switch over to my other screen.
Hey,
Hey.
wanna shoot some hoops?
No, not really.
Alright.
Do you want to play?
Yeah.
Cool. So, hey, you want to go see a movie? Okay.
You wanna kiss?
Yeah.
Me too. Don't worry about being awkward,
Just say what you want.
and ask first.
So again, I feel like it does a good job of just showing us what it could be like if we were a little bit more or a little bit less awkward about asking for things. Like, how could it be just as easy to ask someone for a kiss as to ask them if they wanted to go to a movie? And the thing I like about this video is that there are a bunch of examples of asking for consent, and in some situations the person's saying no, and in some situations they're saying yes. And it's almost like this is what we could get to if we all got a little bit better about having these conversations. And I think that it's a good video to watch with kids and sort of talk about like, what are the different ways that these people were asking each other for consent, and how were they saying yes or no, and how did the other person respond? Because I think it gives a really good example of what that could look like, even if maybe a little bit idealized, but we could get there. I wanted to also talk about the law when it comes to consent, because we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the legal implications of not getting consent when we're talking about sex. We're going to have a whole presentation coming up later in this series about talking to kids about sex and all of those different things, but just to kind of ground us in this understanding of what actually is legal when we're talking about consent in Canada. So the legal age of consent is 16, which means that someone who is over 16 can consent to sexual activity. Kids who are under 12 can't consent to any sexual activity. But then between the ages of 12 and 15, there are these close in age exemptions where someone who is 12 or 13 can consent to sexual activity with someone who is less than 2 years older. And then 14 and 15-year-olds can consent to sexual activity with someone who is less than 5 years older. So that's what that chart explains, which is maybe more or less helpful, just sort of depending on if you're a visual person. But just to say that there's a little bit of leeway within that age range, but basically under 12, any kind of sexual activity is illegal. And then for kids who are under 18, they can't consent to being in pornography or anything else that's considered like an exploitive sort of sexual situation. And the age of consent also increases to 18 if there's a power dynamic. So if the older person is a coach, a tutor, a babysitter, anything like that, then the child would have to be 18 years old to be able to consent. And the other thing to remember about all of this is that these close in age exemptions, or even being 16 or being 18, it only means the consent can be obtained, and then that sexual activity can be legal. If there's no consent, obviously across the board, that's always illegal, and that is assault. All right, so I wanted to just build in a moment where we can all take a little breath, because we just went through a lot of stuff, and hopefully feeling not too overwhelmed at this point, but also if there is a feeling of like, oh my gosh, this is a lot, recognize that that's totally okay too. So just invite everyone to take a moment and maybe just take a couple of deep breaths, maybe take a drink if you have something nearby, and then we'll keep going in a moment. Always a nice reminder for myself too, so that I don't feel like I'm racing through and trying to give more information that is reasonable in an hour. So a few more things about talking to teens about consent. So you want to be specific about the need for consent for both legal and moral reasons. And like I said, we're going to have a whole presentation about this, like sexting and other kinds of things that kids could potentially get in trouble for. But I think that as much as I would love it if people would just be respectful of other people's boundaries and getting consent for moral reasons, sometimes it is also important to remind them that there can be actual legal repercussions for not getting consent from someone for having sexual activity, or especially a thing that comes up for kids is for sharing nudes that people have sent to them. And so those are important conversations to have. And like I said, there's a little bit of kind of not complexity around that, but kids are allowed to send each other nudes or like sexual images, again, if they're in those age ranges on that chart that make it legal, and also only if they are only keeping them for themselves. Showing them to someone else who the photo wasn't intended for is considered like sharing intimate images, which is illegal. And so people could get in trouble for that, which is, and on top of that, of course, this is a terrible thing to do, to share a nude that someone has given you because you're in a relationship and they've trusted you. And so the understanding that not only is that harmful for the person, but that could end up having harmful repercussions for the person who shared the photo as well. It's also really important to talk about consent and substance use, because no one who is drunk, high, asleep, or otherwise incapacitated can consent to sex. But also we know that kids are often, at the same time as they're becoming sexually active, are also experimenting with substances, whether it's alcohol or cannabis or other things. And also this might be a time when, you know, inhibitions are a little bit lowered, and so people are maybe trying things that they would be too embarrassed or awkward to want to try when they were sober. But helping kids understand that it's really important that they know whether or not the person that they're engaging with has the capacity to give consent, and also understanding for themselves what they want to, like how comfortable they would feel doing something when they were drunk, and then, you know, having to deal with the ramifications of that the next day. And so sometimes that might look like, if they're going out to a party where they know that they're going to be drinking, it's sometimes about harm reduction. So maybe it's about talking to a friend who's going to be at that party with you and saying like, okay, don't let me do anything stupid, and like having that backup, or having someone that they know that they can call to come and get them if they feel like they've gotten themselves in an unsafe situation. And again, we'll go a little bit more into that in some of the upcoming presentations, but just having that conversation, because those are often two things that are hard to talk about, both using substances and the idea of kids having sex or engaging in sexual activities. They're so important to talk about, because they do go hand in hand often. And then talking about what to do if someone says no. Like I was saying before, I think that we often end the conversation at, if someone says no, then you just respect that, without talking about how that can feel to the person who has asked for consent. Because especially when we're talking about engaging with someone in an intimate way, it can be really awkward, it can be really vulnerable to put yourself out there to ask someone. And so I think that it's really important to say that it is normal to feel bad if you ask someone for something, whether it's, you know, sexual or otherwise, some kind of intimacy with a person, and they say no, especially if a person has experienced trauma or has attachment issues. That can feel really overwhelming and triggering sometimes. And so if we can help kids understand that someone not wanting to be intimate with them doesn't reflect their value or their self-worth or their ability to be loved or deserving of love, and how they can take care of themselves in a situation where someone says no, and now they're feeling really upset and triggered. And so I think that it's really important that people understand that it's not always easy to hear that, but that feeling of feeling really bad because someone has said no doesn't justify pressuring them or coercing them, or anything like that. So again, it's about taking care of yourself when those feelings come up, and understanding that they won't last forever, and that, you know, they can work through that feeling. And so then again, planning for what to do if that does happen, and then you feel angry or sad or rejected or frustrated or embarrassed, because that really can trigger like a fight or flight response in people. And so maybe talking about having grounding techniques, or just how to talk to a person. If you've put yourself out there and been vulnerable and they've said no, how are you going to deal with that? So again, this is like safety planning and harm reduction to know that you as the person who's received a no, you'll be able to take care of yourself so that you won't act out in a way that's going to be harmful to yourself or the other person. And then also to help kids plan for situations where it might be hard to set a boundary, because sometimes you might think that you know what your boundary is, but then you get into a situation, especially for young people, where they're really trying to fit in. They're trying to find their place. And so sometimes saying no might feel like it's sort of the flip side of getting a no and feeling like now you're unlovable. You might feel like if you say no, then you're not going to get to have any kind of relationship with a person that you want to be close to, or you don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to let them down. Maybe, you know, depending on life experience, you just feel like it's not going to be safe to say no. And so again, helping people and helping kids understand that it really takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery sometimes to stand up for yourself and to stand up for what your boundaries are, and that is a really important thing to do, and help empower them to get better at doing that. And so I think too, it's important to understand like that sometimes when we think about teen relationships, like it can seem a little bit like, oh, you know, like sometimes we don't take it as seriously as kids take it. And so understanding too that like these things can be a really big deal for kids, even if it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us. And so like taking their concerns about these things seriously, and helping them understand how to be safe in those relationships, and letting them know that they are loved and worthy of love, and that they don't have to do things that they're not comfortable with to get that love. And then, like we talked a lot about in the last presentation about trauma, talking about emotions and talking about social skills. And so just continuing to have those conversations and modeling those skills to kids. And so that can mean like modeling consent and boundaries, having conversations about different places where those show up in life, and all the other things that we talked about last time with social and emotional competencies that apply with little kids, but also with teens as they get older. And so again, if you missed the first session, there's a recording of that where we go into a little bit more depth about emotional and social skills. And I think that it's really important that that be like an ongoing conversation, because we don't always have these conversations, and we don't always see good examples of emotional and social skills. But the more that we can talk about it, and the more that we can talk about communicating with other people in respectful and nonviolent ways, then the better we're going to equip kids to have these conversations and be respecting other people's boundaries as well as their own. I wanted to talk a little bit about how trauma affects all of these things, because I think that it's really important to understand that as much as boundary setting in different contexts can be difficult at the best of times, experiencing trauma can add another layer to that. And again, there's a video in the first presentation that kind of talks about some of the physical and like even the brain chemistry effects of trauma. And so I wanted to try to talk a little bit about how that interacts with boundary setting and understanding your own needs, both emotionally and physically. So bear with me if this feels like, if you're just like, I don't understand what you're talking about, that's totally fine. And hopefully some of it will make some sense, and we can talk about it later too in the Q&A if you would like a little bit more understanding of it. But basically, when we experience trauma, as we talked about last time, trauma is something that overwhelms our nervous system and overrides our ability to cope with the situation, either like physically, emotionally, or otherwise, where we just don't have that ability. And so then that ends up in us having this fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And so especially the fawn response is where you're basically trying to placate the other person involved. And so just to reduce that risk or make yourself feel safer, just really like trying to appease that other person. And so we can see especially that the freeze response where you just shut down, or that fawn response where you're trying to placate the other person, are really not going to probably be helpful for ourselves trying to set a boundary. And even the fight or flight responses, they're so just out of our control that we're not in a place where we can be making a good decision and sort of thinking through whether we're respecting our own or other people's boundaries in that moment. And so when you're in a constant state of that feeling of lack of safety and feeling sort of in that really what we call like a hyper arousal mode of feeling that fight or flight, or you've just shut down, then it's not a great place to be understanding what your needs are. And so this can end up looking like experiencing dissociation and daydreaming. So kind of where people who've experienced trauma will just sort of check out because they don't feel safe in their bodies. They don't understand what this feeling of overwhelm is, which is sometimes just like a very normal emotion, but it can feel really scary. And so sometimes people will just kind of check out completely. And so, of course, if you're checked out, then you don't have that awareness of what's going on in your body. And again, this is why we talk about naming and exploring emotions with people who've experienced trauma and body sensations as well, because sometimes if people have spent a lot of time dissociating and kind of out of their body, they don't even understand what their body sensations mean. And so it's hard to know what your needs are, whether that's emotional or otherwise, if you don't even understand the signals from your body. Like you can't recognize when you're feeling unsafe or when you're feeling maybe scared or anxious or upset. And so we can understand that then experiencing trauma can kind of take us outside of our bodies. And then it's hard to know, like, what are situations where I feel good and I feel safe and I want to say yes to someone who wants to be intimate with me, or, you know, I want to do whatever it is that someone else might want to do. And how do I know when my body's giving me a signal that like, oh, this isn't something that I want to be engaging with right now. And so thinking about then how we can kind of get kids back into their bodies and back in touch with what their needs are. And so helping people feel supported, loved, and connected can be a good first step to helping them feel more safe where they are. Again, feeling and naming emotions so that people understand, like, oh, I just like have this weird feeling, like my stomach feels weird and like I feel kind of like, you know, uncomfortable. It's like, oh, well, maybe you're upset, like maybe you're scared, or maybe you're mad, you know, because sometimes we can just become so disconnected from our bodies that we don't even understand that physical sensations sometimes are emotions that are coming up. And so the more we can help kids feel safe and then understand what those feelings are, and that those feelings, if they are emotions, will pass and won't stay forever, then the more that they can start safely feeling those emotions and realizing that they can work through them and understand them. And then doing things like physical activities like sports and dance and yoga, and just grounding techniques like breathing, feeling your body, feeling where your body is in space. Like those things can be really important for people who have spent a lot of time dissociating and outside of their body. Because again, like the more we can understand even just where our bodies are in space, how they're feeling at any given moment, that can be really empowering to start recognizing our own emotions and feelings. And also, there's a lot of empowerment that can come from doing physical activities where your body starts to feel strong and you start to sort of feel like you're the person who is in control of your body and what you do with it. And then, of course, counseling and getting some professional supports can be really helpful for undoing a lot of these things and giving people and kids some tools for getting back into their bodies and understanding themselves. And so all of that is going to help foster that empathy again, because you start to understand yourself, and then you start to understand that other people also feel these things. All of this is also going to, of course, help with self-awareness. Again, both of your physical needs and wants, and also your emotional needs. And that's going to help with feelings of safety. So all of those things, if you understand where you are and what's going on with your body, and if you're feeling safe and loved and connected, then that's going to really help those feelings of safety. And all of that is going to lead to an increased ability to have self-advocacy. And self-advocacy is basically just another way of saying, like, you know how to set and ask for your own boundaries to be respected. And so hopefully that's kind of a bit of an overview of how trauma can make boundaries a little bit harder sometimes, and some steps towards how we can help. And this is like a long process, but just so that we can understand how supporting kids in lots of different ways, and maybe something as simple as getting them to do a little bit of breathing, can be just like another little drop in the bucket to help them get that body awareness and that safety, and to kind of unravel some of those trauma effects. I wanted to also talk a little bit about why people might say yes when in fact they would rather say no, because I think that, again, as I was saying before, a lot of the issues that I'm thinking about in this context is not where people are outright intending to do harm to someone, but where there's miscommunication happening. And so there isn't a clarity about what people want, because it's easy enough to say no means no. And that is, again, incredibly important thing to respect, but also sometimes we don't even know how to say no. And that's not the person's fault. Like, if you, for any of these reasons, are not saying no, even though you wish you could, it's not your fault. And if someone chooses to violate your boundaries, it doesn't mean that you should have done a better job at setting those boundaries, but just to sort of normalize the fact that saying no is not always easy for a lot of different reasons. And so that might be something like just wanting to please people. So kind of that fawn response we talked about, or just, sort of sometimes our conditioning just makes it so that we feel like we need to take care of everyone else's needs above our own. For young people, sometimes it's that sort of fear of missing out. You feel like you're the only one who's not. And so you think, well, all my friends are sending nudes or having sex or going to parties or whatever, so I guess that's what I should be doing too. Not wanting to embarrass the other person, which kind of goes with that people pleasing. Like, you're in a situation where, again, you're sort of putting the needs of the other person above your own. Wanting love and connection, like we talked about, especially with attachment issues. Sometimes you just feel like, well, I want to be close to this person, and this is sort of the only way I know how. Feeling pressured, of course. Sometimes it just doesn't feel like it's safe to say no, or you just feel like worn down by someone, not knowing what you actually want. So going back again to talking about that sort of lack of awareness of your own wants and needs can be make it confusing or hard to know. And just in a moment, sometimes too, again, with trauma, like if you're feeling triggered, it's hard to even think straight. And so you might just sort of be in a mode of like, I don't know, and just sort of not resist, but not really be saying yes either. Feeling like saying no isn't safe, and that can be for a whole host of different reasons, whether it's being worried that the other person will be violent, or you need something from that person that you feel like you won't get if you say no. Being too intoxicated to resist, which of course hopefully the other person recognizes, but sometimes they might not. And then feeling like if you want any kind of contact with that person, that you owe them more. And so feeling like you want to be connected, but you don't necessarily maybe want to go as far as the other person, but you think, well, I was the one who wanted to kiss them or cuddle them or whatever. So I guess this is what they want. And so I'll just go along with it. And then, of course, there are lots of others. And I think it's important to normalize an understanding of these things, because it is easy for people to blame themselves for not saying no when they wanted to, but it's not a clear-cut thing where it's just you don't want to do it, so you say no, and the other person respects it. There's so much gray area in between. And I think that if we can understand that ourselves and then help kids understand that, then there's less shame involved if they've gotten themselves in a situation where they didn't feel like they could say no. Because of course we know, like, when people have experienced sexual assaults and things, that there is a lot of self-blame that happens. But understanding that even if you didn't say no, there were probably lots of reasons, and that it's still not your fault. And then I also just wanted to talk about why people might not get consent, because again, we sort of sometimes talk about these things in a way that's like, well, you should have just asked and you should have just respected the no. But sometimes we don't even know what that would look like. And so again, like, if you don't know what getting consent means or is, and you're in a situation where, you're, again, kind of that social pressure can be happening and you just think like, well, I'm not sure. And so not ever having conversations about consent can lead to not being sure what that's supposed to look like. Again, this kind of goes back to that sort of media portrayal of where, like, people, and usually it's girls, like, the boys think the girls play hard to get. And so you're supposed to sort of go after a person and, not take no for an answer, which is just so harmful. But I think that if we just kind of take in those messages for our whole lives and never think critically about them, then you might not know. Like, and I think again, like, there are often these sort of gendered social pressures where boys think like, oh, I'm supposed to be the one who's pursuing. And so explaining to them that that's not how it works, that you need to be respectful of what people are telling you. Being too focused on your own needs. And so again, this kind of goes back to wanting to foster empathy from a young age, to understand that just because you really want to do something doesn't mean that the other person is saying yes, and doesn't mean that they're on board. And that's really, really important, especially when it comes to things like sex, because again, just can be incredibly harmful for the other person and also can get you in trouble. And so I think that both of those things are really important to understand, that like, this is a fleeting moment of really wanting to maybe have a physical connection with somebody that can have huge long-term implications if you're doing it without the other person being on board. And again, it might be about wanting love and connection. So sort of the same thing from the last slide. It's like, if you want to feel connected to somebody, being intimate might be the only way that you know how to do that. And so maybe sex isn't actually what you want, but you think like, well, this is how I can feel close to this person. Again, those sort of pressured gender roles where boys are often made to feel like they're supposed to be pursuing sex and kind of like, as we talked about, sort of that messed up idea of romance as not taking no for an answer. And so that's kind of the same thing, all those media examples that we see. A lack of awareness about nonverbal signals because of your own experiences with boundary violations. And so this is the other thing too. It's like, we sort of say that no means no, but there are lots of things that mean no that aren't just the words. So someone pulling away, someone sort of acting a bit withdrawn, not responding to your touch. But if you have had a lot of boundary violations yourself because you've experienced abuse, then you don't necessarily know what those nonverbal cues look like or sound like. And so that can be another way that kind of trauma response of not understanding your own body's signals to you means that sometimes you can't understand those signals in other people either. Being unsure about how to communicate about sex, which I think is very common in our culture, is just not something that we talk about. And so then you just don't know. And so you might think, I don't know, maybe they do want to have sex. I'm not sure. I think I do. I'll just keep going. And so we can sort of see how like these things in combination where people don't necessarily know what they want, how to ask the other person what they want, that this is where we can get into a lot of situations where it's just a lot of misunderstanding happening that can lead to a lot of bad outcomes for folks. You can just be straight up too embarrassed to ask, and so you just think, well, I'll just keep going until they say something. But maybe they don't say something because, you know, for all of those reasons we talked about on the last slide. And again, there can be a whole host of other reasons. And I wanted to talk about these things again because I think it's important to recognize that we, especially too when we talk about assault, like, you know, we often think about girls being assaulted and boys being the perpetrators, which is often the case and has a lot to do with those gender roles, but isn't always true. That boys can also be pressured into saying yes when they don't want to, especially because, you know, there is that gendered expectation that boys and men, like, they just always want sex. So like, there's no way that they were, you know, it was done against their will. But so many of these things just come down to not people trying to be harmful or violent, or not because they're trying to assault someone, but just because they don't have the skills to have these conversations, but they still live in a world that is highly sexualized. And so they feel like this is what they should be doing. And so, like I said, we're going to have sort of a whole conversation about that at some point too, later in the series. But just to start thinking about how these things are more complicated and layered than we sometimes think about them. And so lastly, I just wanted to reiterate that talking about consent is more than talking about sex, but you still have to talk about sex. And for lots of us, that's a really uncomfortable conversation, especially when we're thinking about talking to kids about sex, or even just for ourselves. But that's the best and potentially only way we can avoid having people in situations where they're having sex that they don't want to have, is to be able to have clear communication about it, and to be the people that our kids can come to say, like, I'm having, you know, I'm in this situation, I don't know what to do about it. And so, you know, that takes some preparation on our part to be able to be comfortable having those conversations. So something to think about as we kind of move forward with this series, and kind of dig more into those things. So we are coming to the end of the presentation portion of the webinar. So just wanted to check in once again and remind everybody that, you know, if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, that was so much, like, I don't even know what just happened, that's totally normal and okay. The presentation was recorded, so if you want to go back and watch anything that you feel like you just didn't get the first go round, that is available to you. If you're sort of feeling like overwhelmed or distressed or anything like that, that is normal and okay. And just to give you this 24/7 local anti-violence hotline through the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center, again, in case you feel like you need any extra support today. And so that's going to bring us to the end of what I had to chat to you all about. So I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can get into a bit more of a conversation space. And if folks have questions, we can share those questions. So